Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Christa Brún and I lecture in Waterford Institute of Technology. I'm delighted to be participating in this conference, and my paper is on the liminal space of widowhood in Teresa Deevy's wife to James Whelan. So as long as there has been a distinct Irish literature, it has been closely bound to Irish society, culture and family relationships. Indeed, as Anne Enright observes, the question of family is the fundamental unit of Irish culture and one which functions beyond our choosing. In Ireland, the notion of family has been traditionally located within the institution of marriage, which has been devised as the ultimate and highest purpose of heteronormative love relationships. This master narrative of Irish nationhood thus not only places the welfare of the nation in its own definition of family, but it also specifies the role that women must play within such institutions. Women in Irish society in the early 20th century were typically confined to the domestic sphere, and an Irish culture defined in relation to the other, mother, wife, sister and daughter, and widows occupy the interstices of this culture. Identities are created and performed in social and cultural contexts, characterised by historical and contemporary relations of power and control that can affect interpretations and psychological states. This master narrative may be ruptured by a transition which alters expectations, and widowhood occupies such a space in Irish literature. Widowhood is a space of adjustment, coping and grief. It's not simply a transitional place with a fixed exit point. Rather, it is a marginal identity, existing between dominant spaces, and such identification is never simply a movement from one identity to another, but rather a constant process of engagement, contestment and appropriation. So this paper will focus on widowhood and the cultural history of widowhood in Ireland, particularly as it is explored in Deevy's wife to James Whelan. Rejected by Ernest Blythe, managing director of the Abbey Theatre in 1942, the play explores the lives of characters who have historically been confined to the domestic sphere and the private domain, and thus largely hidden from public knowledge. It's therefore timely to reclaim a space for the narrative of widowhood in the public sphere as an integral part of the social fabric of Irish culture, and to create a space for marginalised personal perspectives to inhabit and inform. Colm Tóibín, reflecting on his reading of Mary Lavin's stories of widowhood, observed that the ones that dealt with the life of a widow were almost too close to the space between how we lived then in our house and what was unmentionable, the business of silence around grief, the life of a woman alone, the palpable absence of a man, a husband, a father, our father, my father, the idea of conversation as a way of concealing loss rather than revealing anything, least of all feeling. Thus, the sharing of such narratives provides the stroke that announces something more than a secret shared, but a silence broken, a void filled, an unspeakable thing spoken at last. A liminal space may be defined as a threshold stage, a transitional space, somewhere between one's previous way of structuring one's identity and a new way. Rowe refers to liminality as a place where we are betwixt and between the familiar and the completely unknown. Describing grief as such a space is to suggest that the boundaries that previously provided a secure understanding of the world and sense of self have, following bereavement, become more permeable. One's sense of being in the world is disoriented at the event of loss. The experience of grief has the potential to destabilise the world one lives in and shatter the meanings people use to hold up their world. In relation to widowhood, it refers to somewhere between a woman's previous way and a new way of structuring her identity. Van Gennep first outlined the term liminality in a seminal text, Rites of Passage, and claimed that all passages through the cycle of life shared a threefold sequential structure: separation, liminality, and aggregation. So a rite of passage moves us from every change of place, state, social position and age to another. Rites of separation, such as a funeral, rites of incorporation as in marriages, and rites of transition, the period between stages during which one has left one place or state but has not yet entered or joined the next. The rites of separation he labels preliminal rites. The rites of incorporation are labelled postliminal, and the rites of transition are labelled liminal. Turner consolidated Van Gennep's work, defining liminal as a state betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremony, but introduced the concept of threshold people who elude or slip through the network of classifications that normally locate states and positions in cultural space. This threshold space illustrates the ambiguity of the unique situation of widows in Deevy society. As a liminal figure, the widow is outside the confines of culture and outside the boundaries of the socially and politically dictated spaces of womanhood. Most significantly, the widow never reaches this post-liminal stage. Widowhood thus operates as a never-ending liminality, wherein the widow is perpetually positioned in the structure of lived experience in what Edna O'Brien calls a land of strange, sacrificial women. Deevy's play offers an interior view of the loss, grief, and crisis suffered by the widow. The loss of a husband signifies not only the loss of a spouse, but the woman's loss of her identity. She's a woman who was, but is now no longer, a wife. The widow becomes a figure perpetually defined by both her past and her present, by what she once was, but has ceased to be. The stage direction to Deevy's play note that Nan Bauer speaks quietly, and that her manner throughout is that of one past feeling very much, one whose life is over. The widow is conceived in relation to her romantic and domestic role as wife, either because she has the desire or potential to remarry, or because she's haunted by the emptiness left by the death of her husband. Chakravarti refers to widowhood as a concept of the patriarchal society, where the woman is a member of an institutionalized marginality who strives to live in a liminal state between being physically alive and socially dead. As the cultural history of widowhood in Ireland has been largely hidden from public knowledge, widowhood thus renders the woman invisible and pushes her into a liminal state, both physically and socially. Furthermore, widowhood has historically been perceived as a disruption of social order and a potential threat to moral order. A widow is by definition a liminal creature. She is not sexually intact. She is unattached to any male. Her very unattachment a cause for anxiety, highlighting the danger inherent in existing in such a space. Deevy frequently explores the lives of women who exist in this space, and the situation of widowhood offers a unique opportunity to explore the social fabric into which characters are woven, a society which defines them and confines them and struggles to contain the rupture that is widowhood. Like Jane Austen, Deevy writes of people who live within invisible walls, people who know very little about themselves and yet experience and perceive a great deal. Deevy artfully sketches the story of Nan's emergent recognition of the liminal state she now occupies in the aftermath of her husband's death. The narrative conveys Nan's struggle to regain the identity she lost willingly in marriage, but lost doubly and unwillingly in widowhood. Seidel observes that an exile is someone who inhabits one place and remembers or projects the reality of another. And this exilic mind is evident in many of Deevy's characters. Nan must reconcile herself to the loss of the life she'd imagined and accept the social and psychological reality of the life imposed on her unwillingly by her widowed status, catapulted into liminal space. Wife to James Whelan is a play which conveys the ineffable pain of grief at the death of a husband and the determinedly willed effort required to go on living and relating in a life beyond loss. Deevy thus offers in the play an exploration of grief and the complicated structures that contain this most dramatic of transitions. As a marginalised voice in a public sphere that demanded domesticity and met independence with disdain, Deevy chose to write, and her texts explored and questioned the ideologies that placed women in these liminal spheres, in addition to scrutinising the central values and axioms of the culture in which this occurred. In Wife to James Whelan, Nan has to remake the rules for herself in light of her new identity. Within this identity there are myriad possibilities, and herein lies the anxiety. A key aspect of widowhood, then, is the loss of a stable and fixed idea of the self. Once the protection of a husband no longer exists, the woman's positionality is one of submission or subversion. The positionality of the widow thus hinges on an inverted binary. Either the woman is perceived as helpless, like the widow represented in the Irish National Magazine of 1846, described as timid in the consciousness of unprotected helplessness, or she is positioned as an unattached woman with sexual experience, but without a male guardian, in which case she is perceived as a threat. So widowhood operates as a space wherein dominant ideologies can be renegotiated in terms of emergent ideologies to create a new ideological space. However, as Miller points out, it's a contested space, because the dominant cultural modes of identification never give in easily to emergent ideas that threaten to unseat those historically granted power and control over the dissemination of identity. Widowhood thus remains a socially restricted space, characterized by grief, loss, and unknowing. Widowhood essentially constitutes a social death, and Chakravarty outlines two modes of representing the social death of the widow: ideological and material. The first is ideological in the sense that what was once held as precious by the husband is now turned into a potential threat to society. The widow's social death stems from her alienation from reproduction and sexuality following the loss of her husband, and her exclusion from a functioning family dynamic in the prevailing social context. When Nan Powers is first introduced, she is a carefree young woman whose independence is viewed with disapproval by her neighbours in Kilbeggan. In particular, her refusal to grieve for Whelan when he moves to Dublin incites hostility. Nan says, "It won't break my heart to see him go." And Bill replies, "I think she'll console herself, won't you, Nan, with someone else." After her husband's death, Nan is at first an object of pity. However, the compassion with which Nan is treated by her neighbours inspires suspicion. It designates what Kundera refers to as an inferior second-rate sentiment that connotes a certain condescension towards the sufferer. For to take pity on a woman means that we are better off than she, that we stoop to her level, lower ourselves. Nan attempts to move on from the role of widow and redefine herself as a woman, but her refusal to marry Whelan is dismissed as arrogant. Nan says, "I don't think we'd ever agree. He's too much to master. I couldn't brook him." And Kate replies, "Were you born blind? Couldn't brook him. Some wouldn't mind what they put up with." So it's interesting to observe how sharply the public discourse shifts from one of pity to one of judgment to one of derision. The play provides a critical and unremitting portrait of the refusal of society to allow the widowed woman to move beyond the liminal space of widowhood and redefine herself as a person in her own right, because of the ideological threat outlined by Chakravarty of this unattached woman to society. Of all the liminal characters in Irish literature, it's widows who move closest to the possibility of transition to a post-liminal state. But in reality, there is no aggregation, just annihilation. The space of liminality is threatening because it can provide limitless opportunity to forge new identities and thus allow for creativity and subversive acts due to the eradication of the normal structures that tend to inhibit or obstruct behaviour. It's this sense of unstructure that destabilises and threatens the socially constructed narrative of widowhood, and aggregation is thus foreclosed as a possibility. According to Turner, all liminality must essentially dissolve, for it's a state of great intensity that cannot exist for very long without some sort of structure to stabilise it. However, Deevy's play provides a sobering example of a widow trapped in a form of permanent liminality, far beyond what was initially defined as a temporal state. Turner acknowledges that liminality becomes a permanent condition when any of the phases in this sequence become frozen, as if a film stopped at a particular frame, and the narrative of widowhood exists within a liminal phase that never actualizes into a post-liminal state. Turner further refers to liminal situations as positive periods of renewal. However, as Horvath et al. Argue, liminal situations can also be periods of existential angst and despair. Van Gennep describes this experience as a boundless, marginalised one, often accompanied by isolation and the suspension of social status. In such situations, people often live outside their normal environment, where they come to feel nameless, spatio-temporally dislocated, and socially unstructured. A more permanent period in the stage can also become very dangerous and destructive, resulting, for the widow, in a permanently marginalised state of being, without the possibility of reintegration into a society that has rendered her superfluous. In psychological terms, Jung used the idea of liminality as the process of one becoming individuated, the psychological space in which one becomes differentiated from the collective consciousness and established cultural representations. Meeker et al. Observed that the concept of representation can take either of two forms: as a political act in which women struggle for the right to get political representation, or as a social act in which women represent themselves and their experiences to the world and in the world. So the idea of representation includes women's thoughts about themselves and their community and about how they are represented by society. Literature is a cultural construct, and through literature, Deevy rewrites the narrative of widowhood, challenging the dominant ideology that represents and misrepresents the widowed woman. Meeker observes cultural representations have multiple functions. They reconfigure, reshape, and repeat previously established ideological patterns. Yet, at the same time as these representations act to structure the systems of which they are products, they also work to exclude and deny certain possibilities. From this perspective, social change is not an issue of establishing the truth about things. Rather, it's a product of constantly shifting political and cultural patterns that represent and misrepresent simultaneously. Deevy thus employs literature as a disruptive force, breaking up our fictions about the world we live in and showing us new possibilities for the future. This positionality highlights the insidiousness of an ideology of pure womanhood that places women in an internal exile within the rigidity of the domestic space. A dislocating experience that Eric Gray argues is a consequence of never occupying a place of one's own, but rather being the empty place to be manipulated and inscribed by the male-dominant discourse. Gender ideology thus functions in this context to encourage men and women into family units, the purpose of which is to reproduce and support the prevailing social order. And women who do not make this specific kind of contribution to society, whether through choice or through circumstance, are likely to be viewed with distrust. During this interim, such women stand not inside but between culturally established categories of identity, in an interstitial position. The second mode of representing the social death of the widow, according to Chakravarty, is material, and the figure of Nan Bowers is representative of Irish women's economic vulnerability outside of the family dynamic and the lack of material provision by the state for widowed women. Although widowhood is the time of greatest potential autonomy for women, it's also a time of limits on this autonomy, of public suspicion, and often of an officially supported poverty, the threat of which is omnipresent. Beckett considers the inclusion of widowhood in Wife to James Whelan as a concerted attempt by Deevy to dismantle theories of the family as they relate to specific Irish contexts, despite the difficult historical moment Deevy inhabited in which to do so, a time when Article 41.2 of the Constitution clearly outlined women's place in the home. In particular, the state recognises that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. Article 41.2 further asserts that women shall not be obliged to work outside the family home. The state shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. So such a statement undermines the lived experience and social reality of widowed women in early 20th century Ireland, as expressed clearly in Wife to James Whelan, women like Nan who worked out of economic necessity with little support from the state. Widows are particularly vulnerable to poverty, and Feeney highlights the lack of provision for widows in the Irish state. So it is then that young widows with children form a particular salient example of hardship, according to Feeney. The problem exists because of a political indifference that allows the machinery of assistance to clank past them. The acute, if arbitrary and inconsistent standards used by officers to assess whether a person is justified in seeking assistance means that there are still considerable amounts of need still untouched by the distributive mechanics of welfare. Referring to some of the cases he encountered in his research, Feeney further observed, "No clothes, no shoes, no recreation. It's really a very pathetic account of a grimly opposed and officially supported poverty. The brutality of this system to old people and to mothers with young children is obvious. Because of its marginal political consequences, however, this has not been electorally pursued with the vigour of more politically profitable issues. It's little wonder then, given the punitive economic situation of a widowed woman in early 20th century Ireland, that Nan steals from the desk of James Whelan, a symbol of power and privilege, to feed her child and clothe herself. James' response, an insistence on Nan's arrest despite her desperate circumstances, represents the patriarchal social structures of a society that resents and resists female autonomy, punishing those who challenge the state, and systematic inequalities with confinement. If we consider the reference to the widow in the Irish National Magazine, it's clear that widowhood placed women in not only a liminal state, but a marginalised state of separation and ambiguity. She's a widow, a poor old widow, and oh, what a miserable struggle has she had since the death of her husband, which happened many years ago. He was in a respectable way, but left nothing behind him. While he lived, all was well, they were comfortable, something more than not affluent. But his death, which was sudden, brought a miserable change. The event at once rendered her nearly destitute. So the widow of the story is a pitiful and pitied creature, and representative of the economic and social instability that followed the transition to the liminal space of widowhood. Likewise, in Wife to James Whelan, Deevy highlights the vulnerability of widowhood. James said, "I was sorry the old man left you nothing." And Nan replies, "He hadn't nothing to leave. The pension died with him, you know." And James replies, 3 years a widow, and now you've nothing." So the portrayal of Nan as a pitiful figure bears testament to the official discourse surrounding the introduction of the Limited Widows and Orphans Pension Act of 1935, which describes widows as, quote, deserving and helpless people, and precedes the political attention to the ideology of widowhood in the 1960s with the Succession Act of 1965. When Charlie Haughey, the Minister for Justice in 1965, was introducing the Succession Act, he sought to put provisions in place to prevent situations where spouses could make wills which effectively cut off recently widowed women without money, or in the case of a wife married to a farmer, where everything would be given to a son, with the widow only inheriting right of residence in the farmhouse, for it was almost always the case that a house or a business or a farm was solely owned by the man. And this is how the term legal right share was introduced into Irish law, and was the first law to confer any semblance of autonomy on the widowed woman. Now, cultural, political and religious shifts have invariably created a shift in sensibilities around the concept of widowhood, and the ideological structure of widowhood embedded in Irish culture has been challenged by the work of many modern Irish female writers. Deevy offers a sensitive exploration of a private world of grief, a liminal world of becoming and unbecoming, and in sharing these previously unspoken narratives of widowhood, she's begun to heal the wounds of social memory and to create the possibility of an ethical function in weaving the entangled strands of disparate personal histories into the social fabric of Irish culture. Hirsch uses the term post-memory to describe the relationship that later generations or distant contemporary witnesses bear to the personal, collective and cultural trauma of others, to experiences they remember or know only by means of stories, images and behaviours. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus actually mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection and creation. Therefore, through these narratives of widowhood conveyed in the plays of Teresa Deevy, we can bear testament, through imaginative investment, to these lives unexplored, and offer a pathway to understanding and project and create possibilities for progression. Thank you very much.